So thank you on behalf of the International Society for Quality of Life Studies for joining this webinar titled ISQOLS webinar, Family Relationships and Children's Well-Being, presented by Dr. Stephanie Hess. And now, to introduce our presenter, Stephanie is a postdoctoral researcher at the Otto von Guericke University Magdeburg in Germany, where she also completed her PhD. Her work lies at the intersection of family sociology, social stratification, and social indicators research, with a particular focus on how family environments and social inequality shape well-being across the life course. Using theory-driven quantitative and longitudinal approaches, she studies how parents' experiences, emotions, and values are transmitted across generations, and how these processes contribute to individuals' quality of life. Her recent work examines how children themselves perceive their well-being, how parents' experiences impact their offspring well-being, and how self-reports differ from parent reports, particularly in the context of emotional distress. She also won the 2025 ISQOLS Best Dissertation Award for titled Family Members, a Multi-System Investigation of Children's Subjective Well-Being. Stephanie, it's an honor for us to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Also, on my behalf, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I am super happy to be here with you to discuss a topic that has long been a huge part of my life, because it is the topic of my PhD thesis: children's subjective well-being and the central role of family relationships. One disclaimer right up front: I will only talk about two-parent families today, so please keep that in mind during the webinar. As most of you might know, the subjective well-being of adults has been measured, compared, and monitored across countries since somewhere around the 1960s. The Journal of Social Indicators Research, for example, was founded in 1974. In contrast, children's perspectives have often been filtered through the eyes of adults, especially the parents. But children experience their own emotions, relationships, and environments in very unique ways. Their voices matter, and their self-assessments provide insights that adult reports alone cannot capture. I would like to start with giving you some reasons why it is relevant to shed light on the interrelation of parents' lives and children's well-being. First of all, being the demographer I was trained to be, demographics. In Europe, nearly a fourth of households were home to at least one child. This share varies between 18% and more than 35% in Slovenia. So in short, many households live with children. They are part of everyday life and a substantial population, even on the continent with the lowest of low fertility rates in the world. Simultaneously, children are somewhat prone to vulnerability. In 2022, 1 in 4 minors in the EU were at risk of poverty or social exclusion. Globally, we saw 16% of children living in extreme poverty. 10 to 20% of European children grow up with a mentally ill parent, thus living in unstable family circumstances. And finally, a not to be ignored share of children is exposed to violence. Across the European Union, 23% of children are estimated to experience physical and 29% emotional abuse. And while adult well-being under adverse conditions is quite well documented, little is known about how children themselves experience and cope with these circumstances. But why should we care? Well, first of all, higher levels of child well-being has been shown to be accompanied by stronger engagement in school and higher motivation to learn new things or do well in academic settings. And if students fare better in the educational system, this is, of course, good for human capital and economic productivity of a society in the long run. Secondly, studies suggest that children with higher subjective well-being show better physical health and long-term resilience. And with crumbling healthcare systems all over Europe, this might be a very good investment. And finally, happier children tend to form quantitatively and qualitatively more positive relationships, and they show greater empathy, enhancing community harmony and reducing conflict, likely even on the societal level. And in times of crisis and all the conflicts we see in the world, this again might be a really good investment. Given these motivations, the first central question that arises is, what exactly is child well-being? Let's briefly talk about the most common theoretical approaches. And I would like to start with one of the most prominent, most employed and cited theoretical frameworks in child research, Uri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. His book, The Ecology of Human Development, is cited nearly 80,000 times according to Google Scholar, and it's only the final product, so everything he did before has nearly as many citations. Bronfenbrenner suggests that child development is influenced by a number of interrelated systems. The most important system is thought to be the microsystem, which is comprised of direct interactions with significant others, such as parents or peers. Child development is also impacted by the so-called mesosystem, the relationships between individuals of the child's microsystem. So, for example, the parents' relationship with each other, or the relationship between parents and teachers. The third relevant system is the exosystem, which encompasses social structures and circumstances of other individuals of the microsystem. A prominent example that illustrates what the exosystem is about is the parents' workplaces. They determine, for example, the economic situation of the family, as well as the time available for family activities. Child development is fourth determined by the macrosystem, overarching characteristics of the societies children live in, such as values and cultural beliefs. And finally, Bronfenbrenner highlights the importance of time in development through the chronosystem. This includes both individual life transitions, such as starting school or leaving the parental home, and a broader historical or societal change, like growing up during an economic recession or a pandemic. And this framework also inspired a widely used concept provided by UNICEF. UNICEF defines a good childhood as positive experiences now and the prospects of a good future. And the child is again at the center in this concept with objective outcomes. For example, mortality, school achievements, as well as subjective outcomes such as life satisfactions. This is thought to be influenced by layers that are called the world of the child, which are direct experiences, activities, family, peers, so what Bronfenbrenner refers to as the microsystem. The world around the child are thought to be resources and networks, so this is a mixture of the meso and the exosystem. And finally, the world at large, national policies and the broader context, the macrosystem. And with regard to outcomes, the UNICEF's definition of child well-being is primarily captured in indicators that directly measure children's own outcomes. These include three dimensions: mental well-being, life satisfaction and suicide rates, physical health, overweight, obesity and child mortality, and finally skills, meaning academic skills such as reading and math proficiency, as well as social skills. And even though the UNICEF framework is super helpful for researchers across the globe, it is important to remember that children's own voices are central to understanding their subjective well-being. They provide valuable insights into what well-being means. A qualitative study conducted in 2018 highlights that children indeed link well-being to satisfaction, as shown in this quote by a 9-year-old boy who said, "I'm satisfied when I make my family happy." The authors also saw elements of an understanding of eudaimonia, the idea of meaning and flourishing, for example, feeling happy when somebody in the family or oneself succeeds. And finally, children describe their own well-being through positive emotions, feeling happy when something nice happens, helping at home, or spending time with family. But they also express negative effects, such as feeling bad after arguments or conflict. In a nutshell, they unknowingly mention concepts that we also define for adult samples, but we see one distinctive feature in these child answers. They all reference their families and family members. This strong focus on relationship is also mirrored in research. A systematic literature review covering articles between 2000 and 2009 found that this dimension is by far the most researched when studying subjective well-being in children, followed by physical well-being, but as we see, social relationships are more than double. So if relationships, feelings, and daily experiences matter so much for children and researchers alike, the next question is, how do we actually measure child well-being? And to answer that, we turn to the indicators used to capture children's lives. I would like to start with the Reporter of Children's Subjective Well-being. For my PhD thesis, I also conducted a systematic literature review focusing on quantitative articles that examined the relationships between family relations and children's subjective well-being. And what I found is that the vast majority of the 100 articles I screened only relied on parent-reported child outcomes. Only roughly a third made use of children's self-reports. This is, however, rather problematic because parent and child reports have repeatedly been shown to not be congruent at all. Parents tend to underestimate their children's emotional problems, overestimate behavioral problems, and often misidentify the underlying mechanisms. So research attributed this mismatch to parents' tendency of being biased by their own experiences and sentiments, as well as, at least to a certain extent, social desirability bias. And as most of you might know, there is this final tiny detail. If we want to truly understand subjective well-being, we need to capture the assessment by the individual itself. So self-reports are needed, also if we talk about children. And this directly leads us to the child indicators movement. Historically, child research was very adult-centered. It has long reflected the parents' perspectives, and children were seen as incomplete or not yet competent agents. They were defined as becomings rather than beings. So traditionally, childhood was viewed as a preparatory phase for adulthood rather than a meaningful life stage in its own right. But since social realities changed vastly in the recent decades, keywords here are modernization and individualization, childhoods diversified worldwide. And today, childhood varies culturally and socially, offering multiple pathways and life chances. Children's autonomy and self-determination increases, and this increasing freedom enables children to shape their own identities, values, and life goals, and thus their own subjective well-being. And following this cascade of societal transitions, research too increasingly included children's self-reports on life satisfaction, psychological well-being, and social well-being. And roughly since the early 2000s, the child indicators movement aims to track trends over time and provide country comparative results in order to guide policies that enhance children's subjective well-being. However, as of now, there is no agreed upon set of items that measure children's well-being, though the colleagues working at the Data of Children's Worlds worked really hard on that, providing good measures. One central aspect, however, is very agreed upon. The measurement should be child-centered. Children's self-reports need to be implemented, and measuring tools should be age and culture sensitive. A very neat documentation of the development can be found in the journal Child Indicators Research for anyone who's interested. And one question that I heard over and over and over again while working with child-reported data was, at what ages children can really reflect on their own well-being? Well, they are younger than you might expect. Developmental psychology suggests that 6 to 8-year-olds are already able to express basic emotions on a small range scale, for example, 0 to 3, or oftentimes we use emoticon scales. In middle childhood, at the ages between 9 and 11 years, the improved language and cognitive skills enable children to give more nuanced self-assessments. Children begin comparing their well-being to others, and they can handle slightly larger rating scales. At the transition to adolescence, somewhere around 12 years old, they develop self-reflection and abstract thinking skills. And from this stage on, they are capable of using the 10 or 11-point Likert scales we also employ for the adults. So adolescents can engage in surveys and interviews, providing a very rich qualitative and quantitative databases. So in practice, there's no problem using self-reports if they are adapted to children's needs. When we do, we gain direct access to how children actually feel and evaluate their daily lives. But as we've seen before, children do not experience well-being in isolation. Their emotions, opportunities, and sense of security are strongly shaped by environments they grow up in, especially their families. So let's turn to the next section. How do families shape children's well-being? Families shape daily routines, emotional security, learning opportunities, and how children cope with challenges. Children's well-being is deeply embedded in family dynamics. Their lives are shaped by parents' resources, behaviors, and emotional states. I really want to stress this again. Children and their well-being are inseparable from their caregivers, who provide essential resources from shelter and safety to economic means and time or emotional support. Children depend on their families and are not fully autonomous. Moreover, families are the driving force behind children's socialization. Parents model their behaviors and the norms that shape children's functioning and well-being throughout life. And finally, families matter because early life resources shape life chances and the whole life course. Parental investment in human, social, and psychological capital strongly influence children's future life trajectories. We know that a loving, supportive parent-child relationship is associated with higher levels of multiple well-being dimensions across the life course, whereas adverse childhood experiences such as abuse or trauma have lasting negative consequences. In other words, families have a severe life course significance. The quality of early family relationships sets the reference standard children use to evaluate their lives, and they influence relationships and well-being across adulthood. The central importance of family for children is also mirrored in their own descriptions when they are asked what one needs to be well. They describe relationships in general, but also with their family and siblings in particular. And again, the $1 million question is, what does research find on the interrelation of family relationships and children's well-being? I will focus on subjective well-being outcomes in the next few minutes because a full description of quality of life would just go way beyond the scope of this webinar. And the current state of literature addresses 4 main determinants of subjective well-being that are, non-surprisingly, also quite congruent with the Bronfenbrenner framework. We have first a lot of research on parent-child relationships, some on interparental relationships, a little about parental well-being, and fourth, research was very interested in parents' working conditions. So let's dive in. First of all, the most important message of this webinar is that studies impressively and unequivocally demonstrate that positive parenting practices and parental involvement are very good for their children's subjective well-being. Warm parenting behavior, engagement, and positive family relationships promote better social skills, higher happiness, they lead to fewer problem behaviors, and shared family time and co-parenting quality have been consistently shown to be beneficial. Cross-country studies suggest that the benefits of supportive family climates for child well-being are quite universal. Moreover, parenting stress and practices frequently mediate the effect of family stresses, such as poverty or conflict, on child outcomes. In other words, positive parenting can act as a buffer. In contrast, negative parenting and maltreatment have just as clearly been linked to child ill-being. Physical and emotional maltreatment, such as spanking, abuse, or harsh discipline, consistently predict higher internalizing and externalizing problems in children. Harsh and punitive parenting, this is non-physical but verbal parenting, is linked to greater problem behavior, negative affect, and lower happiness. A not so fun fact here is that reporting discrepancies between parents and children suggest possible biases in maltreatment assessments. Parents report maltreatment less often than children, and this might either be a social desirability bias or a different perception of what harsh parenting actually is. And finally, insecure attachment and parenting stress are associated with more behavioral and emotional problems and lower social well-being. Some studies suggest that these negative effects are particularly harmful in early childhood and in low-income families. Similar effects were found for the impact of interparental relationships on children's subjective outcome. High-quality, supportive relationships between parents are consistently linked to fewer internalizing and externalizing problems in children, and supportive co-parenting fosters more positive parenting behaviors, particularly among mothers, which is associated with higher well-being, as we've just learned. And again, negative interparental dynamics have clear detrimental well-being effects. Parental conflict and partner violence predict higher levels of child behavioral and emotional problems, peer difficulties, and lower global well-being, and children exposed to high conflict homes, for example, are often show greater anxiety and aggression because they seem to mirror the behavior they witness at home between the parents in their peer environments. Noteworthy, the influence of parents' relationship quality appears to be sensitive to child gender. Boys' well-being and behavior seems to surprisingly be more strongly affected by interparental dynamics than girls. So family relationships with each other seem to be very predictive of children's subjective well-being. But literature identified a third really relevant family-related factor, the parents' well-being. First of all, research linked poor physical health in parents to lower child life satisfaction and more internalizing and externalizing problems. More important, however, seems to be parental mental health. Paternal and maternal depression in particular are consistently associated with greater emotional and behavioral difficulties, lower psychological well-being, and weaker social skills. These associations are strongest in vulnerable families, but they seem to persist regardless of socioeconomic status. Mental health oftentimes serves as a mediator. It mediates the link between economic strain, work stress, and adverse living conditions, and children's problem behavior. It also transmits effects of discrimination and low social support to child mental health outcomes. Put differently, research is suggesting an intergenerational transmission of subjective well-being, where parents' life satisfaction is positively associated with that of their children. Parents' mental problems are associated with more mental problems in children. And now, leaving the immediate family environment, let's have a look at the final big research strand that refers to the effect of parental working conditions on children. Again, I would like to start with the positive news. Parental employment is generally really good for children's subjective well-being, especially if mothers, for example, transition from welfare benefits to gainful employment. However, it all comes down to parents' working conditions. Unsurprisingly, research tackled adverse working conditions first and found that high work stress, schedule inflexibility, long commutes, and work-family conflict to worse child outcomes. But again, evidence is a little mixed. For non-standard working hours, for example, a study using German data suggests that maternal night and weekend work increases children's internal and externalizing problems, but a study that used US data did not find significant effects. Studies suggest that the mechanism behind these negative effects is that stress or irregular work conditions again impact the parent-child relationship and parenting quality, which then in turn reduces children's well-being and increase behavioral problems. And because this was quite a lot to remember, I just pitched you a brief summary of everything I read during my PhD. Let me give you a very brief summary of the current state of literature. Good parent-child relationships, a good relationship between the parents, high parental well-being, and good, and that means family-friendly in particular, working conditions are generally beneficial for children's subjective well-being. And I would like to end this section of my talk with the universality of this family relation well-being link. In one of my articles where I used before COVID data, I found this positive relationship between good family relations and children's life satisfaction in 39 countries all over the globe. What you see here in the map is the B coefficient of family relations on life satisfaction. And it is somewhat bigger in some countries than in others, but the effect strength varies with cultural value climate. But there is not one single country where I did not find a positive relationship. This gives us a really reassuring message. Strong family relationships matter for children's well-being everywhere, regardless of culture or country. But then COVID hit, and a new question emerged. What happens when everyday family life is suddenly disrupted? When schools close, routines collapse, stress rises, and families are forced into an entirely new reality. And this brings me to the final part of this presentation. What about the COVID-19 pandemic? Let's first take a look at this OECD figure based on PISA data. What we see here is a clear and worrying trend. In almost all OECD countries, children today report lower life satisfaction than just a decade ago. The OECD average has dropped from 7.4 in 2015 to 6.7 in 2022. According to the OECD, the decline is statistically significant in 25 out of the 28 countries for which data are available. The share of adolescents reporting very low life satisfaction, meaning a value of 4 or below, has risen sharply. Across OECD countries, this group grew from 12% in 2015 to 18% in 2022. This increase occurred in nearly every country. At the one other hand of the scale, we see the opposite development. Highly satisfied adolescents, those scoring 9 or 10, have become much less common. Most countries show a significant drop, sometimes up to 20 percentage points. So overall, the picture is clear. Fewer adolescents are very satisfied with life and more are struggling. The decline is broad, widespread, and visible across most OECD countries. And this dissatisfaction also shows in sharply increasing subjective health complaints. In the Health Behavior in School-Aged Children survey, children were asked, in the last 6 months, how often have you had the following? Headache, stomach ache, backache, feeling low, irritable or bad-tempered, nervous, having difficulties in getting to sleep and feeling dizzy, and all of these are symptoms of either anxiety disorders or depressiveness. Data shown here refer to the percentage responding more than once a week or about every day on 2 or more of these symptoms. And again, we see that the share of 11 to 15-year-olds increased sharply in every single country that was monitored. For the OECD in total, we see an increase of 13 percentage points. In the countries, this ranges between 4 percentage points and in Spain and 27 percentage points in England. So what about COVID? The pandemic confronted children with an existential threat unknown to younger generations. When we look at children's subjective well-being during the COVID-19 period, one area stands out as especially affected: mental well-being. Across many countries, COVID-19 containment measures such as school closures, reduced social contact and lockdowns, this led to significantly higher levels of loneliness among children and adolescents, and at the same time, mental disorders have been rising globally. And this increase is particularly pronounced among the youngest age group. Several studies report a sharp increase in anxiety disorders, depression, and social phobia among children and teenagers. We also see the consequences in the healthcare systems. An increasing number of young people are being admitted into psychiatric facilities, reflecting the growing severity of mental health challenges. So while COVID-19 affected many dimensions of children's lives, the mental health impact has been especially profound. And moreover, the pandemic increased family strain. Evidence suggests that domestic violence has increased by up to 60% during the lockdowns in some regions. With strict containment measures in place, children spend significantly more time at home, often in very confined spaces. As a result, many children were more exposed to parental stress, conflict, or violence than under normal circumstances. And when families were under pressure, children were directly affected, emotionally and physically. In a nutshell, child and adolescent well-being has decreased. So what do we take from these theoretical ideas and empirical findings? What can we do to at least try to ease this COVID burden? For us as researchers, I would suggest employing multi-informant approaches to assess child well-being more often. To understand children's well-being and how to improve their subjective, psychological, and emotional well-being, we should take parents and children into account. Also, when investigating parental life worlds, for example, having a look at the other family members might produce really valuable insights. For policy, the message is clear. Supporting child well-being is a long-term investment, and aiming to help undoing the COVID harm, action is needed. A broader understanding of how parents' lives transfer to child outcomes allows policymakers to design better family policies that promote higher life satisfaction, strengthens human capital, children's development, improve population mental and physical health in general, and contribute to social cohesion, as I said in the beginning. All of this supports long-term economic productivity, growth, and societal stability. And this also means providing better care arrangements and more flexible work options to reduce strain on caregivers. And crucially, we need policy support to keep data collection ongoing and monitor everything that happens so we can see where problems emerge and respond early. And finally, for practice, a key finding is that parental problems often affect children through parenting behavior, especially verbal interactions. The literature suggests that verbal abuse should be recognized as a form of maltreatment because words matter and can harm children's subjective well-being. For practice, it could also be really helpful to bring this multi-perspectives, this multi-informant approach into family therapy, because one viewpoint alone taken from the parent rarely captures the full reality of children's daily lives. And with this outlook, I think I'm really good on time. Thank you very much for your attention. And now feel free to fire all your questions and ideas at me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It was a great presentation. Now we're going to the Q&A session. So please, you can turn on your cameras. And if you want to ask any question to Stephanie, now is the moment. So is there anyone who wants to ask a question? I could... Kelsey, please start.
Hi, Stephanie. Very nice presentation. I was trying to take notes, and then I decided I'm just going to have to refer back to the recording. So thank you for that. I have potentially a few questions, but perhaps most interesting for my own work. Is it possible to compare young people with adults and such that we could draw a new life course? And so a lot of times we think of there being a U-shape, with the midlife being the lowest level of life satisfaction or subjective well-being. Could we extend this back to the young people at, let's say, 8 years of age? And what would it look like if so?
I was actually talking to Alan Piper about that. We have the data. So there are some, not many, but we have some data sets that actually start capturing lives at the age of 7 or 6. And we could actually have a look into it because, for example, in the German family panel, it's called PERFAM, they are integrated in the new FRIDA dataset. So we could actually track life courses quite a lot. What I think is more difficult is to superficially extend it backwards, because you always have to consider that life course trajectories are dependent on the time, on the historical time point you are monitoring. The very, very low well-being during COVID, for example, is not something you would witness in, for example, millennials. We are not as hit as the really young generation Alpha. So yeah, does this answer your question?
Yes, and I guess I was hoping maybe you'd give me an expectation also. So are young people on a 1 to 10 scale, what are they reporting themselves to be on average? And then I'm just thinking maybe I can ballpark that, assuming that it would be similar to a,
Okay. So before COVID, this is the last time that I looked into the Children's World's data. I know that there is now an after COVID wave, but I still didn't get my fingers on it. But before COVID, children were crazy happy. The unhappiest children in the world were happier than the Finns on average. The Hong Kong children scored 8.7, I think, if I remember correctly. So they were really, really happy. There are children that report 2s and 3s, but on average, children are just really, which I would argue is some kind of empirical hint for the U-shape, because when we monitor children, they are actually quite happy. And the downshift happens the first time during teenage years. At least this is what we can witness in the German data. So it's when they hit puberty, they start thinking about how they look, how everything works. They become aware of everything that's really, really exhausting about life. So yeah, but I think we have some more data and we should actually systematically look into it, because they are, as I said, not many researchers really use the child-reported data. There are some that write articles using PISA or HSBC, but we have a lot of data available. So one really rich database actually is the German Family Panel, because you have a multi-actor design. You can actually compare parents and children. You can build the whole family system. You even have information from the grandparents, but they are underutilized. So if everyone is interested in doing more research on that, I'm all in.
Thank you, Kelsey. Agustin, if you can turn your camera on also. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Very interesting presentation. So I think I had read some research about the link between your own children well-being and your adult well-being, and then you talk about then the well-being of parents. And I think I had read some of that as well, which is like they looked at the adults' well-being and the well-being of their mother when they were a kid, and they could still observe that. And so I'm a consultant, and so I'm really interested in the kind of policy implication, and what kind of evidence exists on the kind of like things we can actually do to fix that problem? Because you kind of seem to mention that here there is COVID, so there is like a whole structural thing that has created havoc on the well-being of children. Then you talk really about the fact that it's the parents' well-being has a strong impact. So perhaps there's nothing we can do to improve the children well-being. You need to fix the parent relationship to kind of like improve their well-being, perhaps. But I also see that there is like it's an article on the BBC. There is a big rise in the amount of people that kind of they're out of work because there's poor mental health and things like that. And I'm kind of wondering to which extent we kind of see it coming now with low well-being of children, kind of how they're going to get into work when they get to adulthood and things like that. So what are I guess it's the difficult question as a researcher to be so prescriptive about what to do, but what are the kind of, in your view, the hint as to kind of what we should be looking at doing? And obviously you're kind of saying we need to use that data more, so I'm suspecting there's more research to be done to prove it, but I'm kind of interested in where perhaps the hint towards the main action we should be taking.
I mean, this indeed is a really difficult question. Being a researcher, I would always suggest keeping a look at the long-running data sets, because this is statistically the best opportunity we have to really model this long-term impacts. We have I know that there are some US American samples that run for quite a long time, where you can actually model what happened during childhood, and they are monitored during their adulthood again. So this is the one thing we could do as researchers, just trying to secure the funding for these kinds of data sets. From a practical perspective, I think most importantly is actually what I said for the implications. We actually should make parents aware that maltreatment is not only physical, harsh, punitive parenting, because children realize when you are talking really harshly to them, and it has these effects. Research really, really impressively shows this, that if you start arguing with your child or you call it names, this has long-lasting effects, because it impacts the parent-child attachment. And if we started to make parents more aware that it's not only physical maltreatment that has these negative effects. This could be really, really, really necessary. On the other hand, I think one thing that we need to think about is having children in institutions, because here in Germany, for example, children are really, really, really have a long time with their parents. They spend quite a lot of time because kindergarten and school normally end somewhere around 1 to 3 in the afternoon. Some have it until 5, but again, they spend quite a lot of time at home. And if you are exposed to these negative parent-child interactions, this is quite bad. But we know from social learning theory, for example, proposed by Bandura, child researchers should know that thing, that it's not only parents that can serve as these role models. And I think it might be worth thinking about promoting other role models. So, for example, integrating children into something like their football club or after-school clubs again, so that they can have other adults that can help. Because this is actually something we see for collectivist societies, that the parents do not as harshly impact the child's well-being as it is the case for very individualized societies. So
Thanks.
this is from my research, this would be the two very obvious practical things to do.
Agustin, do you want to add anything more?
Yeah, I was gonna say, because I think the key, and I think that, so we don't really have the answer. I think that's the gist, but because if we look at the data, we then can understand what predicts different levels. The trick is that there is, can't remember, and there's a bit of a debate, but there's a range of things that is due to our genetics, our environment. And so then if we identify that, I don't know, perhaps the harsh treatment of parents has an effect, negative effect. I'm just thinking about if we develop an intervention to try to correct that, that might not work, right? And that's kind of what I'm aiming at, is that actually just finding intervention that is going to work is not necessarily comes from looking at existing data. Sometimes we kind of need to design the intervention and try it out. And so you kind of, I think you got you gave me the answer, is we're going to have to try some stuff we don't really know yet, because if we look at observational data, we can't really work out what are the successful intervention. So you have some hints, and you told about like changing parenting, for example. But for example, with the COVID thing, I'm just kind of really wondering what we do, but the rise in loneliness, the social interaction, how do we make interaction not happening at home happen in society? It's a bit of a tricky challenge for policymaker.
It definitely is. And I was actually talking to quite a lot of child well-being researchers in Luxembourg, and we all wonder how to improve it. I think one thing that would be necessary to start this conversation is making it more obvious. Just making it central, because when I started preparing this webinar, I actually had to search for quite a while to find something like a dashboard. You find dashboards for death tolls, you find something about the mental health of elderly. They are in the center of this discussion, but children and adolescents are often overlooked because they are a smaller proportion of the population. And I think this would be a start, just to make it, because everyone has this felt reality, this feeling of it's getting worse for the young children. But I think it would be necessary to really make it publicly known and show it to each and every single one. Because if you talk to older, somewhere around 50, 60-year-olds, they always argument that we've had it bad too. They just need to get themselves together, because they do not see the real turnout. And we are not talking about being a little sad. What I presented with the mental health thing during COVID, these are actually diagnosis. What's the word? They are diagnosed. So it's not children are unhappy and self-diagnose themselves with being depressive. These are actually real diagnosis. So this is a huge crisis we have there, and we need to tackle it. But it's always put in this case of, well, yeah, they just need to get their stuff together.
We have now a question of Jill, but Kelsey, do you have a follow-up question or?
Yeah, it is related. So Jill, forgive me. I was thinking of childhood poverty. And when you talk about that, then I feel like it is more commonly a more commonly held concern. And so I wonder if you think that how much that overlaps with child well-being, and because I do feel like people are worried about that, and there are policies that have been demonstrated to improve this. In the US context during COVID, there were targeted checks for people who had children at home. And apparently that was the best example we have of reducing child poverty in the US history, as far as I'm aware. So we actually do know a fair amount in some cases, and people do claim to care about this. But then maybe child well-being is too fuzzy of a topic. It's even more fuzzy than adult well-being, which is already difficult to sell. Thanks.
Well, first of all, child poverty definitely negatively impacts child well-being. So this is one of the really, really certain facts. It's nearly as certain as parents matter for children. And I agree that it's easier to tackle child poverty because it's clearly defined and you can take clear measures and clear policy steps to relieve this burden. It is way harder to tackle mental health because it is way more exhausting to tackle mental health because it's super individual and you cannot do one size does not fit all. So it might be worth thinking about just talking about mental problems instead of psychological well-being, for example, because mental problems is easier to measure, is easier to conceptualize, to operationalize. But again, I think the biggest problem is that we needed to make policymakers aware that there is this problem and to take it seriously. Because again, I can just talk for the German context, but we talk about old age poverty way more than child poverty. Way, way more. It's always in the focus of the center, and it's always the first problem that is to be fixed, which is of course a huge problem and we should fix it, but we are neglecting the future workforce. So it's like enforcing all these problems and making it bigger. It's like exponential problem growth. So I think we should, but it's actually a good idea to think about it more in measurable ways and not talking about in measurable for each and every single one, because we know that we can measure subjective well-being by asking people. But if we defined mental problems as the first thing to tackle, this might be helpful.
Great. Stephanie, now a question on cultural background that I know that you also were interested. Jill is saying, you found that the strong family relationships are beneficial for children's well-being across all countries. Could you elaborate on what is the role of cultural background and cultural values that play in this association? For example, cultural norms around the family roles or the child autonomy, how it shapes those relationships affecting well-being?
That's a super neat question, and I prepared something for that. What I did in the paper is I actually had a look into the relationship between cultural values in terms of collectivism versus individualism. And what we see is that in the pooled sample, family relations explain about 14% of the variance in children's life satisfaction. But the R-squared varies widely across the countries from just over 1% in Uganda, which is, can you see my mouse? Wait. You can see my mouse, I hope.
Yes.
Which is down here, but it's very high, 39% in Hong Kong. So overall, we see that family relations are a very strong predictor, and it's a slightly stronger predictor in individualistic countries than in collectivist ones. And what is super interesting about that is that this seems to be not really linear. I tried to model it, but so we do not have yet a real U shape. It's not statistically significant, but what we see is that with increasing individualism in the collectivist countries, the R squared is lower, and with increasing individualism in the individualistic countries, it is higher. So what this suggests is that while children in collectivist societies have a bigger family, so there are aunts and uncles, other adults that can help, that can, for example, what's ersetzen in English? Replace bad family relations with parents. This is not the case in very individualistic societies where there's the core family, so mother, father, and the child, or mother, mother, and the child, or father, father, and the child. So what this means is that children actually rely on their caregivers in their life satisfaction, the more individualized they are. And they can, if they are collectivist societies, they can rely on other aunts and uncles, so their life satisfaction is not hit as badly. But this is something we really should look into, because child research has focused quite a lot on something like GDP, so societal wealth, and social inequality and the meaning for children's well-being. But I think cultural values are the real key. So one would look, for example, on power distance in the future, because I think there might be some more music in there.
Which was related to my next question, that Hofstede also considers other cultural values beyond collectivism and individualism. So it could also be interesting to see if there are other strong associations, for instance, exactly power distance. And also, is there any evidence of families that maybe come from a cultural background that migrate to a completely different one, how this affects the development, or it does have no effect? I don't know if there is any evidence on that, especially nowadays, where the migration topic is becoming, very important, no, in the public discussion.
There is some qualitative research going on migrant families. We do not have a really good quantitative database yet, but qualitative research suggests that families migrating from collectivist to individualistic societies are hit way harder than the other way around. It does not have an impact if you move between collectivist cultures or individualist cultures, as it seems, but there is some evidence that moving from collectivist to individualistic really hits. Well, on the one hand, you split up your family, because most of the times it's not the whole family that's defined in the collectivistic culture, including aunts, uncles, friends, and so on. They do not move together, so they miss some of the family. So the core of the family is really, really shrunken together. And this is the first thing that really hits, and it changes the family dynamics. And this is what the research is. I can, if you're interested, I can look up the paper.
Sure. Which brings me to another question, unless there is anyone that also wants to ask another question. What is the role of peers and teachers, and also, I would say, of grandparents, that maybe sometimes, where the parents are divorced, in non-parental and families, that they spend a lot of time with their grandparents? Is there any evidence on these three actors?
I mean, I can help you for school relations. What we see here is, again, the R squared that results from family relations and school relations on subjective well-being. So these are two different models, and what we see is that family relations are more predictive than school relations, including the peers and the teachers, in 21 countries. 10 collectivist, 11 individualistic, and it's the other way around in only 12 countries. There we have more collectivist than individualistic countries. What I cannot say yet is how societal development factors in. This is work in preparation, so I hope that I might be telling you more at the next ISQOLS conference. But this is what happens in the family versus school relations section. And what was the other thing you wanted to know about? We had school, we had families, and
Yeah, and also about children that are living that are or growing up in non-traditional family structures. For instance, that they spend most of the time with their grandparents, or only with the father, or only with the mother. If there is also any evidence of this can affect their well-being.
So we know a little about single parents. The general mechanisms are similar. So if there is a good relationship between the parents, even if they have separated, this is very beneficial. If it is a huge war between the parents, really bad. This is not surprising there. In general, the first limited evidence on rainbow families, for example, suggests that, again, the mechanisms are very similar. So if we have good relationships, if everything is harmonious, then children fare really good. And we do not see differences between heteronormative families and the rainbow families. So yeah, that's what we know right now. Children are actually quite simple. If they have a good surrounding, if everything works really well, they fare good, because they really just want to be seen and they want to be secure. They actually always try to secure their surroundings and feel secure in their surroundings. There are quite a lot of studies about interparental conflict that stress this again and again.
Perfect, Stephanie. So we are reaching 5 p.m. for those in Europe. Kelsey, do you want to do any last?
If I may, Stephanie.
Always,
I
Kelsey.
imagine, thanks. I imagine you read the World Happiness Report 2024, and there's a chapter on your bread and butter, adolescent and young people well-being. So it looks like the trend is positive around the world for young adolescent well-being, but the PISA data show a negative trend. Do you have a feeling that the data are different? And of course, there is systematic differences, perhaps in the number of countries or the composition of countries, also the ages. Or maybe you think the Gallup World Poll or the PISA data are rubbish. Do you have a feeling for why we might be getting different results?
I think it's a question of sample composition on the one hand, because what we saw today is the children's worlds are captured in schools, so it's not they answer the questionnaire in schools first of all. The World Gallup data are huge. I've never had a look into them, so I cannot always or someone writes the Gallup World Poll sample is too small. I'm not really sure, because I've never had my fingers on the Gallup World Poll data, I have to admit. I would love to. I'm actually thinking about applying to the World Happiness Report for the next year. But I think it's also a question of measurements, because children's worlds, for example, they really, really aim to get a good measure, to find out how we can really, really good measure child well-being, how to make it age and culture appropriate. We have this discussion also for the adult samples. So Kuba Chris, for example, he's really advocating for it. And I think it's the same for children, because again, yeah, children are might be more culture sensitive. We don't know yet. So I would not say it's rubbish, but I can't really say. But we need to be aware of measurement differences and composition differences, because as I mentioned in the slide of how old children should be and what scales to ask, if you are talking to a 6-year-old, you can't come with the 11-point scale. It won't be able to answer. So this is the question: what kind of measure did they use, and how exactly did the questionnaire look like, and so on.
Thanks. That's helpful. I do know the Gallup World Poll, but I didn't know if you had looked at it differently. To respond to Augustine, it starts at the age of 15. It's usually about 1,500 people per. In some countries, it's as much as 4,000, like in China. But yeah. So what you said makes perfect sense. I thought maybe there might be something I was missing. Thanks.
So, thank you everyone for participating in Stephanie's webinar. Please be sure to participate in all of the ISQOLS webinar sessions, and also to follow us in social media, also in Instagram. And we'll be posting this recording and all the other session recordings in our platform soon. And thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. And to our participants. And see you in either one of the next 3 conferences that we are going to have in Buenos Aires, in Kentucky, and also the virtual conference. So bye-bye, arrivederci, adios, and see you very soon. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you so much. That was really great. Thank you.